Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Property Investor Podcast. This is the podcast where I speak to some of the most interesting, inspiring, and resilient people in property investing and beyond. And you know me very well. I am, of course, your host, Paul Lanfear. Now, my inner lawyer needs me to tell you the usual stuff before we begin, which, of course, nothing in the podcast is financial, legal, or health advice. Obviously, do your own due diligence. So it's with genuine delight I introduce you to today's guest, and we've got a lot to talk about. So today's guest is Julie Talbot. Now, she has got a really fascinating backstory, which we're going to get into in a bit of detail in a minute. But essentially, she has lived for 12 years in Abu Dhabi as an expat. Her husband has worked out there as well, and she was like a stay-at-home mum. In the beginning of 2022, they've moved away and they've set off on this remarkable journey, which is one of the subject matters that we're going to discuss today, which is, in Julie's own words, she says doesn't quite know what to put the title as. Is it digital nomad, which I think it probably is, or is it traveling family? Basically, they're traveling the world, homeschooling their kids, and at the same time growing their UK portfolio, which is pretty astonishing. We'll understand a bit more of that as we progress. So, Julie, very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me on, and I am really excited to speak to you about your chosen topic of today.
Yeah, me too. I know, and I picked up there were two rules that you live by, and we'll come back to these two rules. But the two rules you live by are: don't fly back to the UK, and do not and do not have your phone ring.
Yeah.
I love those rules.
They kind of came from really practical situation. At the time when I put them in place, my kids were 3. Mm-hmm. I was kind of like stopping a day job, like a part-time job that I had, wanted to do more in property, and just thought the only way I can make this work is if I don't have to fly back to the UK. Like, my husband had the expat job. He used to fly around the Middle East at the drop of a hat, like, come home one night, I'm going to Kuwait tomorrow, Jules. And I'd be like, so I couldn't fly back to the UK. And the kids were 3. I don't know if you had a 3-year-old around and you try and answer the phone, but it becomes like Mallet's mallet. Like, so I just thought, I can't do anything if my phone has to ring. So there were various reasons why I moved into property, but I just thought that they're like 2 things that absolutely have to stay in place to make this work. And I've just never really let go of them, really.
Perfect. So those are your rules for life. Now, I think we should probably mention Tom Dillon, in fairness. So a big shout out to Tom Dillon. Obviously, we met through Tom Dillon. Mm-hmm. He runs the excellent Cuppa Property Meet in Manchester. He also has the really fantastic Cuppa podcast, and he has helped me as well with this podcast as well. So, like, shout out to Tom Dillon for bringing us together and allowing this to take place.
Yeah, exactly. Tommy's spectacular. He's also helped me with some kind of bits of knowledge as well sometimes. I've worked with him on some things, and his meet is just, what I love about his meet is it's part face to face and it's part virtual, so he captures everybody. It's like, everyone's included. Yeah,
very good. So shout out to Tom. So the theme of these current property investor podcasts are the macro view. So there's a lot going on in the world, and we're bombarded by all kinds of information. And in those circumstances, it's very difficult, I think, to really identify what's signal and not noise. And I think the highest value is actually identifying the bigger trends, because if you can identify the bigger trends, you can kind of position forwards for them. And I think your current lifestyle probably represents one of the trends that we are emerging. And the great pleasure in talking to you about it is, like, you're the real deal. You're actually doing it. This isn't like an ad on Instagram. You're actually doing this. So I want to get into your lifestyle, understand the logistics of it, like the ideology, if you have any ideology behind it, and all the rest of it. But before we get there, it'd be great, I think, particularly in the context of what we're going to go on to talk about, is to understand your origin story. So can you, obviously we want to get onto the property and we want to understand that, but how did we get to the property? So tell us a little bit about you know, like where were you born, what family life was like, and how you kind of got from that place into property.
Okay, so all the way back. All right, okay. So I'm from Salford, I was born in Salford. My parents separated. We were a low-income family, so we were basically on housing benefit and rented accommodation that way. So I have been, in my childhood, treated quite badly, should we say, by letting agents and landlords who would say, we don't want people like you here. I remember a letting agent saying that to us one day when my mum tried to take us in a house, and people saying to us as we're walking, oh, we don't want to live in that street, that's where they live, like, the people on housing benefit. And I remember thinking, well, it's money, like, just because we've had unfortunate circumstances, like, so I like that was kind of through childhood. I then started corporate work and had a brilliant job, just really enjoyed it, traveled a lot around Europe, and kind of like mid-20s just kind of like thought, I just haven't got life, I'm just traveling somewhere every week, which is fantastic, but it's just quite, it wasn't nomadic, it was just quite just didn't feel like I was living anywhere. And always wanted to set up a business and wanted to have some sort of business, did the whole rich dad poor dad sort of thing, and thought I can really see that I wanted to have some kind of business. Looked at various things and kind of settled on, like, actually, I could be a landlord. I could see being a landlord as a business. Through my kind of like childhood experiences of landlord, I really appreciated that people needed homes for the long term. Like, we had landlords sell our home, which was really disruptive and kind of unnecessary, although probably necessary for a landlord, but that they hadn't gone into it with a long-term view, should we say. So I kind of thought, I'm gonna be a landlord who holds properties for the long term. So this was all at the kind of time that we were thinking about, let's move overseas. I was ready to come out of corporate work, and I thought, yes, I will grow a property portfolio, I will grow a property business. This was 2009. I could really see that there was a really big demand for people, to have long-term rental properties, whether they're on housing benefit or not. But there's just a lot of people who rent long-term, because if we could have stayed in a house for 20 years through my childhood, we'd have stayed for 20 years. We only moved because landlords kept selling the houses or wanting to increase the rent beyond our means. In the year that we moved overseas, which was 2009, it was one of those crazy years, where just lots of stuff happens. Like, we got married, we bought a couple of houses, we moved overseas, like, all just like happened, boom, 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 within a few months. And with that confidence, having bought a few houses, I was like, yes, I'm just gonna carry this on now. I'll buy a few houses a year, just like I've done this year. What could possibly go wrong? It will all be, it'll all be fine from Abu Dhabi. And I then proceeded to buy a few houses in the UK whilst being in Abu Dhabi. I tried a few different ways of doing it. I flew backwards and forwards for a while, and that was like, kind of, you just felt like you had two lives. That worked, but wasn't really it wasn't scalable, right? It wasn't how I wanted to be living my life. I worked with a sourcing agent, and it went quite wrong. I take full accountability for how it went wrong. My decisions, I'm accountable, but it really scared me and I basically cried a lot, spent a lot of time hiding under the table, and didn't actually talk about property really to anybody for 7 years. I was embarrassed, I was ashamed that things could go so wrong. And in my expat kind of like friendships and circles and things like that, if people would say that they wanted to buy a property, I'd just kind of like be a bit mute, not really contribute, and just try and move the conversation on, like, oh, look, should we, look, the sun's bright today, just exit the conversation. And then in 2017, we got the phone call that kind of like every expat dreads, really, which is, the middle of the night call, which says, someone's ill and it's really serious, and come quick kind of thing. So we did that, and, there's a funeral a few months afterwards. And in those moments, you just don't really think about costs and things like that. You just go to where you need to be. And we then, off the back of that, went back to the UK for the funeral. And, we're meant to fly back 5 days later. My husband kind of asked me if me and the kids would stay in the UK to be around family, really, just through those first few months. And I had a part-time job at the time, and the kids were in school, and it was like, okay, so we're going to stay in the UK, we're going to take the kids out of school, I'm going to need to rent a house, and see you later, husband, you'll come over once a month. The family was going through, all those sort of stages, so we didn't want to, it was, you can imagine, it was a difficult time. So I just scaled hugely back my work. And with the evenings and stuff, I just thought, I realised the only thing that was paying me, this was the thing, as our costs soared, the only thing that was really paying me in that time was the single lets that I bought, where I'd made mistakes, back in 2009. And I just thought, why am I wasting my time working for somebody else? I mean, I was only doing 18 hours a week. It was easy. It fit in with life. It was from home. I did it when the kids were sleeping. But when life went upside down, which life does, because that's what happens, they didn't carry on paying me. And it was just that start, we just need to focus on figuring out how the heck to earn more income, like this property income that we've got. There was a bit of, we've put man on the moon, for heaven's sake. Like, we can't be letting 4,000 miles get in the way of us growing a property portfolio. So let's just take a concrete pill, toughen up, and figure out a way. And that's when I was like, how are we going to make this work? Well, I can't have my phone ringing because the kids, I've got twins, they just jump up and down. And although we were going to be in the UK for a few months, I was, totally consumed with them. So, and then we're going to be going back to the UK. So I couldn't be flying back to the UK. So yeah, that's where all the constraints came from, and the jolt, really, to be like, I just need to find out how to earn more of that sort of income, rather than the pay you for the time type of income, which goes when you need it most.
Wow. So there's quite a lot to go into there. And obviously, I mean, I'm really sorry for your loss. It's obviously something which is still like at the surface as well. And so, I'm very, very sorry for that. And it's interesting that there are all these life moments, aren't they, that are like a massive jolt. And it's fascinating when you speak to people to see what direction it takes them in, and what people make of them. But let's circle back to some parts of the earlier part of the kind of chronology, if you like. Like, one bit I'm really fascinated to dip into, if you don't mind, is this experience with the deal sourcer, and this kind of your description of it having not gone well to plan. So do you mind giving us like a bit of a sketch of what that's about? Like, why didn't it go well? Like, what's your perception of it not going well?
Yeah, so I mean, I take full accountability. I totally bought into what everyone tells you when you move overseas or when you live overseas, which is, well, you can't buy a house now you're not in the UK. You need to either buy new build off plan, or you need to work with a sourcing agent. That's what you need to do. They're the only ways. And this is kind of like fired at you from like mortgage brokers and just other people. It's just it's a belief. So I didn't even question it. I was just like, well, yeah, I'm an expat now. I've tried the whole flying back to the UK thing. That didn't work. It wasn't scalable. I wanted to be growing a portfolio. So I was like, well, I don't really want new build off plans. At the time, it wasn't my strategy. So I just, assumed then that I would have to go with a sourcing agent. So I don't want to say my heart wasn't in it, but it wasn't the way that I'd envisaged working. I'm quite passionate about property. I'd sourced my own previous properties. I kind of like knew how things worked. And the sourcing agent threw, a few properties our way, which were moving on. They, for various reasons fell through, as properties, sometimes do. So I was very aware that this person was putting in time and deals were falling through. And I said yes to something, and it ended up being the full story is one for another day, but the headline is, the vendor maintained owning part of it. I owned part of it, so it ended up being a building that I didn't fully own, and it took me 10 years to kind of like just get the ownership of all the building, which when all of us owned a bit of a part of it rather than one person owning all of it, it wasn't as valuable as one person owning the whole piece. It was just a mess.
So can we describe it as being like the deal from hell, basically?
Yeah. And maybe it wasn't so much the deal sources per se, but like decisions I'd made, but it was something that had gone that had gone wrong, and it just, it caused me to pause for 7 years, because I still then bought into this whole, you can't do it without flying back to the UK. So yeah, it's sort of.
So you felt like you got your fingers burnt with this particular project, and that led you to kind of have this period of hiatus, this 7 years pause, which obviously you're not unique in. I mean, it's most investors in the UK only own one property. They're like the stats are like absolutely phenomenal. They do one. They probably don't have the greatest experience because the first one is always the hardest, and then that's kind of where they then pause. But obviously, you then kind of moving forwards, life-changing event, and then you kind of really kicked into gear. And obviously you have grown now you are legitimately like financially free. You have a portfolio that sustains you, even though you live in a much more glamorous or you're currently residing in a more glamorous location. There was one bit that I just wanted to kind of just check if I heard it right. Did you say we had to swallow the concrete pill?
Just toughen up, Julie.
I love that. But is this like, so I've never heard that as an expression. So just give that to me. So is the expression take the concrete pill, toughen up?
Just take a concrete pill. Someone says it. I should probably Google who says it. I think it's a comedian who says it or something. But it's something that's kind of like stuck with me, of just like, take the concrete pill, just toughen up and get on with it, because doing this from overseas and expat staying home and all that kind of thing, there wasn't a lot of other people in the same world as me, shall I say. So I could find lots of excuses just to stall myself and get in my own head. So that was some of my self-talk.
So take the concrete pill and toughen up. So then talk us through like how this works then. So what is your strategy? So specifically, like what kind of what kinds of things do you invest in? Broadly, like tell us a little bit about geographic location. One of my first mentors he would never be drawn on where he invested, quite rightly so, and he would never also encourage other people to be drawn. So he always used to use the expression, a northern town. So you're welcome to use a northern town if you wish, but like what kind of assets do you invest in? Broad location, like what's the overall strategy? And obviously in asking this question, I'm not seeking to invade your privacy, so I don't want you to reveal anything that you don't wish to, but give us a bit of an overview so we can understand like what does this portfolio look like, and then take us into a little bit of the mechanics about how on earth you do this from the road, if you like, with a family. Because full disclosure, there were lots of people who listen to this podcast who are doing property in the UK, and they're finding it hard, and they're finding it hard even just to do it from the UK. And you've added this whole layer of complexity across the top of it. So yeah, talk a little bit about your portfolio and how on earth you're achieving it as a strategy.
Okay. So just in terms of the portfolio, it's good old, I don't want to say boring portfolio, but it's a good old single lets. 2-3 bedrooms, semis, terraces, started off there. Stepped into, HMOs. I've done, I used to do a bit of portfolio building for some other overseas people. It kind of always blew my mind a bit, really, that people who were overseas would trust me as another person who was overseas to grow their portfolio. But it works. It was like, I'm doing it for myself. I would do it for a really small number of other people as well. So that what it's like when you're buying property. If you're buying one a year, you don't get to build your machine or your habits or your routines. But if you've got a few going through, then you can create habits and routines and systems and ways of working. You've got that constant momentum, which just sort of works. I don't tend to do sourcing for other people anymore. Like, I've stopped doing that. I've just got a small number of investors who now I kind of like grow their portfolio and mine at the same time at a slow and steady pace, really. So yeah, single lets, HMOs, a mix of private tenants, a mix of some more corporate long-term tenants, and repeating really what works. Some of the projects will have differences. Sometimes the HMOs might have en suites, as a difference and things like that. But I'll say boring because it's, sometimes it can be exciting to like step up to the next thing, and step up to the next thing, and step up to the next thing. But for me, life is first. Location freedom and financial and time freedom are really, really important to me. Your kids are only young once, and we lived overseas, and now we're traveling. Like, I want life to be about that. So, but my property business is still important, but it needs to fit in. So one of the ways that I kind of make that work is by keeping things keeping things simple. So yeah, that's the sort of outline, should we say, of the property portfolio. Is that a good sort of?
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really, really helpful. I suppose if we look at, like, without wanting to date the podcast too much, but if we look at like one of the key topics right now is how HMOs are faring with the higher interest rates, particularly if investors have had to, they've come to the end of their, let's say, a discounted fixed product, and they're now onto the variable, and then, they're looking for new finance. That coupled with higher energy costs. So, how are your HMOs weathering those particular storms? And I suppose, do you have any golden nuggets lying in there of how you've dealt with these kind of the current challenges of the day in the HMO market?
Yeah, so again, I'm always trying to look for ways to make things simple, and I think you can make things simple in your strategy. And there are some tenants that are like maybe really high yielding, should we say, private HMOs for example, but the income then is also quite variable as well, because tenants can come and go, and because of the rents, like you say. So these days for my HMOs, I tend to put the whole house on a lease to somebody else who's a longer term tenant. Okay. So the rent might not be as much, but I know how much I'm going to be getting because it's fixed for the length of time of my mortgage, kind of thing, and I've not got the overheads that go with it. So that for me keeps things simple. I'm not like seeing if people have paid, seeing what the invoices are, and things like that. I'm taking out some of the moving parts from the overall property machine just to kind of like keep it as to reduce as much variability, for want of a better word, as possible.
Got you. So is that like a supported living company or something like that? You're like you're doing a long lease of your asset without all the overheads, which is one of the current challenges that people are facing.
Yeah, and I did used to do private HMOs, and it was just up and down, because we always knew we were going to be traveling, and having managed that, I just thought, I just want that. It was intentionally looking for ways to make things, to make things simpler. So made that change quite a few years ago now.
Perfect. Understood. So hence, as you say, like the real simplicity of the model, you've got single ASTs, and then you've got effectively corporate lets, if you like. And so nice, steady, predictable income without some of the shocks to the system that can occur in the private rented sector. So then let's talk, there's two elements of this that I think will be really useful. So one is how you manage on the ongoing portfolio, because even with long-term tenants, life happens, doesn't it? So, tenants have to move on, relocate for job, for work, for education, what have you. And also stuff happens with properties. And equally, I think it would be fascinating to understand how you have continued to grow the portfolio remotely. So let's take those in reverse order. So let's start with the growth of the portfolio. So how are you managing from not being in the UK to grow this portfolio? How are you finding projects? How are you viewing them? How are you securing the funding, for example? Is it that you're creating surplus capital from another enterprise and investing in property, or are you, for example, refinancing existing assets? So tell us a little bit about the growth first of all, and then we'll get into the management later on.
So I suppose it's kind of like painting with your hands behind your back. It's just got to do everything differently. So in terms of how we're funding, same as everybody else, I suppose, really, refinancing properties, and also I work with private investors as well. So, same usual sort of things. In terms of sourcing, I've done all sorts of different ways of finding properties over the years, all the weird and wonderful things that, you know, everybody does. And at the end of the day, you know, I just think there's deals to be found on Rightmove. And I'm a bit of a one for just being consistent and I don't want to say disciplined, but, you know, it's unlikely you're going to find the first property that you see that you're going to put an offer in that you're going to get it. But, you know, if you're viewing regularly and you're just being consistent and doing the thing and showing up, you know, then it's how we all find deals. It's really the discipline, I suppose, of just, you know, just being consistent. I was listening to something the other day, actually, that it was that Darren Hardy had written, which was, you know, sometimes it's not about what we do that helps us achieve, you know, success and meet our goals and things like that. It's the things that we choose not to do, right? So, you know, what are you choosing not to do instead, you know, like whether that's, you know, social media or what you're choosing not to spend, just to free up your capacity and energy and things like that. And I don't put lots of time on this because, you know, value time freedom, we're traveling, we're, you know, exploring. So it's just comes down to having a, you know, list of tasks, I suppose, that you know you need to do at what frequency, and doing them. So, you know, emails, for example, I would not be trying to do emails all day. I'd be like batching them and checking into emails once a day, right? To manage that time. I don't always get it right, but that's kind of like the theory. So there's no magic bullet. I think a lot of it is we do what we decide we want to do. And like I think it was Henry Ford who said, well, you think you can or think you can't, you're right. And there are lots of people who say to me, oh, I really want to do what you're doing, but I can't. I'm like, well, why can't you? Like, I'm doing it. I'm not making it up, and I'm not superhuman, and I'm not special. I'm a kid from Salford who just, you know, got a bit desperate and just decided to find a way to make it work or die trying, really, because my husband was sick of listening to me talk about property and do nothing about it. So if you decide that things are stopping you, then they'll stop you. But if you decide you want to do it, then your mind's really powerful. Like, if you decide you want to do something, then you just find a way.
And so I think there's two absolute gems in there. One is obviously you're finding your deals off Rightmove. You know, I think often property is portrayed as being more complicated than it is. So, for example, you know, what is it, like 90% of all property transactions are simply done through a estate agent. You know, like that tells you a lot if you think about it. It's like that's where it all is. And you know, when you were speaking, I underlined the word consistency, because that's a theme that's obviously emerged from this conversation around you clearly have habits and routines and you are consistent in your action that's creating the results. So in terms of consistency, let's just take that into, like, let's take that deeper, a layer or two. So presumably you're not one of these people who I don't actually think exist, who, you know, every offer you've ever made on a property has been accepted on the first day, and the agent has been keen to just post you through the keys and you know, and leave the rest of it. So can you talk a little bit about, like, what, as a remote digital nomad property investor, wife, mum, how consistent, like, talk a little bit more about consistency. So
So I think it's, do you know what, I'm forgetting the statistic at the moment. It's either 1 or 3 or 1 in 4 property deals falls through from the point at which an offer is accepted to the point at which, you know, it completes, sort of thing. So for me, consistency is it's viewing regularly, you know, small amounts of viewings regularly. And just because you viewed a property and your offer's not been accepted doesn't mean that it's not going to come back to you 3, 6, 9, 12 months later. You know, it's sort of, I also kind of like find that if you're in momentum, and this is one of the reasons why I found it really valuable, and it was a real win-win to be, you know, just helping a small number of other people grow their portfolios, because that allowed me to constantly have this conveyor belt sort of like, you know, running. So I was constantly in momentum. So when you've got a transaction going through, you're speaking to people, and then another you might just pick up on something that helps you with a with a new transaction. Whereas if you're just going out to get one property and you get that one property and then you like shut the door, then you don't pick up on all those other deals that come back to the market, because so many deals do just fall out of bed. So it's showing up really. It's something, I've support some other expats, who want to do something similar, and it's something that we really work on. Just getting like a regular viewing routine in. It's not just like go out and view one house, offer and stop. It's like just be consistent, show up every week for a few weeks and for a few months, and just you learn so much, and you become a bit like Ron Seal. You do what you say you're going to do, and it's I don't want to say property investing is, I never would say it's easy, but it's simple if you're going to be consistent and sort of like show up for your business and for yourself, for your own machine regularly.
And I in doing the research for the podcast, it looks to me, do you have a product that helps guide people as to how to do remote viewings, or have I misunderstood what I was seeing on your profiles and stuff? So for example, so what I'm alluding to is view from overseas. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, because that looks fascinating?
Yeah, so so many expats and digital nomads who I speak to, want to buy property, but just assume that they can't. And there's lots of blocks in the process, but if you get over the belief that you can do it, then the next thing is, but how can I view? How can I view? And you find yourself having the same conversation quite a few times, and you realise that afterwards you realise that you missed things and that you missed things and that you missed things. So yeah, I've got like a that's a 60-minute just short workshop on just my overall process for doing viewings, and like a checklist for anyone who wants to do the same. And some people have done that, and I've had one lady message me, and she's like, "You've literally saved me £15,000. I was going to work with this person. I've now done this. I've secured 3 houses," and just like and she was she was a mum as well in the Middle East. So some people just that just kind of like frees them. I've just finished last week actually a free mini series that I do every so often, and I had a bit of time over the last few weeks, so I did it, where I kind of like talk about the 3 ways that, amongst other things, 3 ways that, as overseas people, you can grow a portfolio, because there's no one right way to do it. We're all different. We've all got different skills and different things that we like and don't like doing. But I find that when you are overseas, people speak to you about, like, oh, you must do it this way now, or you must do it that way now. So I just kind of like done this, this sort of free series where I say, look, these are all the ways I've done it. Here's the pros and cons to each. And I've been doing some Q&As over the last week just to help people choose the way that's right for them. And some people just take that and run with it. And then a few people, I do end up supporting them one-on-one whilst they put their own strategy in place and implement. But I just I don't want people to be blocked by this. Oh, I'm overseas. I've now got to wait until I'm back in the UK to grow my portfolio. I've got to wait until I retire, or I've got to wait until I go back for the summer, or there's so many spouses, they call us Australian spouses, when you're an expat wife, who either think they can't work or take really low paid jobs because they want to work, but you've got to be flexible. And I'm like, look, growing a portfolio, it just for me was the perfect job as a job in inverted commas, as a stay-at-home expat mum, and it still fits in as like a traveling sort of life, really. So yeah, sort of try and share this. I've got on emails that I send out, on my socials, just to break down this barrier of like it's not possible and I can't do it. I'm like, it is. You can if you want to. If you want to, you can do it.
Well, look, we're definitely going to put in the show notes your social media links, the link specifically to viewfromoverseas.com, and we're also going to put the link to you have like a newsletter as well. So I think we'll definitely put that in the show notes. So then, slightly conscious of time because we've both got a deadline, and I want us to kind of get into I think the interesting theme that you raised with me, which is that this whole concept of digital nomad. So I said at the outset, like, it's a real pleasure to speak to the real thing, because obviously we see on Instagram and all kinds of things, adverts that are using the kind of imagery of digital nomad in order to sell products, but you are actually the legit, you are the real deal. So, and I know this is a subject which is really close to your heart. So tell us, like the floor is yours. Tell us about the life of a digital nomad.
Okay, well, I'm amazingly inspired that there is a new country coming, and the country is the state of the digital nomad. And so many people that I speak to say that they want to live like this, but they think they can't. But there's just like this groundswell of people. And I saw a statistic, and this is what I shared with you, wasn't it? That by 2035, there's going to be 1 billion people living this lifestyle. Like, this isn't a trend anymore. It's not something that's kind of like, coming. It's like, it's here, it's established. It's just actually growing. It's, us digital nomads, we're a subset of remote workers, right? Where a remote worker is somebody who, works from home, maybe their employment is somewhere else. And digital nomads do that, but with this, we're a subset of virtual workers, in that we, we either run our businesses, as I do, or have actual full or part-time employment whilst traveling, and have that whole location freedom. And there's that whole financial FIRE movement, like financial independence, retire early thing, which I totally get. And I don't know, I don't want to say in a sat well movement, because it did, I got it. But for me, it's more about like location independence. I was trying to think of a cool acronym, like as an opposite to FIRE, like, I don't know, location independence first and then explore, or something. Because why put off like the freedom that you want to travel, to be with your kids, to explore the world? Like, why put that off if you can find a way to earn an income? And property is possible, but there are so many other ways of how to grow an income whilst you travel. So, for me, how it works, I don't want to say there's no magic, but it's like I've said before, it's systems, it's routines, it's habits, and things like that. I share in my emails, but it's really just being clear on what it is you want to do. So, I'm a bit of an early morning kind of person, so I will, tend to get up before somebody else. I'm a huge believer in being clear on your goals, and then just doing the whole 1% thing, like one small task towards each goal each day. And do that first, before you put the washing on, before you make the breakfast, before you whatever. And you think, it's easy to do, it's easy not to do, but that kind of like moves the dial forward. And that can be drafting an email to somebody, it can be chasing up on that refinance application, it can be, whatever it is. So our days are like a lot of people's days. I do a little bit of that in the morning before the kids wake up. I then, at the moment, we've got into a little habit where one of the kids goes out to have a coffee and get some breakfast from a street food stand, and then we'll, come back, have breakfast with everybody else, and do a little bit of homeschool, and then explore. Sometimes we still have film days, and then sometimes we go out and explore, and then in the evenings I'll follow up and catch up on the stuff that needs doing. So it's the whole small regular steps, keeping things simple, really. There's various ways of making this whole location independence life work. And I think you had Mike Stenhouse on a few weeks ago, didn't you? And he's done there's the whole boat life thing, right, where he's traveled boat life but with a hub, because there's various ways of making this work. So we obviously travel all the time. We've got no fixed hub, we just move along as the wind takes us. Mike's inside property, and him and Victoria's model is that they used to have the boat, they'd be on some of the year, and then they'd go back to their hub of the UK for some of the year. There's van life, some people do van life. I see I think it's called Como Properties, where they are traveling around for part of the year in their van. I think they're in Europe at the moment. And then there's other people who kind of like travel and who pause here and there. There's one amazing family who I've been chatting to at the moment who are like traveling similar to how we are, but their aspiration, intention, they're called Meet the Arshads, is to kind of like form a base where they like or a hub, should we say, probably somewhere in Asia, where they bring people together and build communities there. So there's just so many ways to make like traveling life, location independence work. And if you've got that wanderlust inside you, you know if you've got it. Some people really want to do this. Some people really don't want to do it. But if you have, then the whole location dependence, what did I say? First and explore, the whole life model rather than the fire model. It's there. It's there to be done, really.
Awesome. So for those that aren't too familiar with the FIRE model, it is the whole like financial independence, retire early. And one of the cornerstones of the model is to reduce your expenses in such a way that you can kind of leave early. Some people absolutely love the model and adopt it. I think I've had previous people on the podcast whose I think legitimate criticism of the model is that some people interpret it in a way that means they don't really live their life. They scrimp and save so much that they never see the world, but yet they don't have a job. And there is another way of doing it, which is you find something that you really enjoy doing, you travel the world doing that, and you have a rich and fulfilling life. Yeah,
and I've been kind of looking at some of the statistics around digital nomad life, because people assume, and I think the FIRE model maybe pushes this in so much as that you need to have a huge lump sum before you can travel or do have the time freedom or the location freedom that you want. But I was looking at, there's a digital nomad survey. I think it was on the state of digital nomad. It's published every year, and they were saying that the average budget of a digital nomad is something like $1,700 per month. If you're living in Southeast Asia, for example, and there's rents and street food and things like that, then it doesn't have to cost a lot of money. I have met so many, quite a few single parent families, single mums who are traveling with children. And when I asked them why, they're like, well, apart from the rich experience that we're giving our children, you still can't afford to live in the home country and have a great life. Whereas if they're traveling, they spend so much less and are just having a really great experience. And I hadn't really thought of it from that point of view. For why some people do it. Before we set off and started to meet people who were doing it for that reason.
I think that is referenced, in Tim Ferriss's The 4-Hour Workweek, when he talks about geographic arbitrage, that you have a job in one jurisdiction that, the pay is reflective of that jurisdiction. I think he gives the example of a Google engineer, so therefore a really chunky salary. But you live in Thailand or you live in Bali, and you're able to effectively exploit, the different, the completely different cost of living and the different locations. Sorry. Well, I suppose my question then was, have you taken inspiration from Tim Ferriss or anywhere else? And if you have, pointers in those directions, and people can kind of explore for themselves.
Yeah, Tim Ferriss 4-Hour Workweek. It's one of those. It just gets in your head as a mindset of just how a different way of living is possible. Yeah. What are the ones? That really is a main one. It kind of opens your eyes to how you can have location freedom and time freedom whilst kind of growing an income. I was going to say then that some countries are kind of recognizing this sort of trend of digital nomads. I can't remember if I mentioned it at the start, but there's now 54 countries that offer visas for digital nomads, and you don't have to use those. There are other visas to get, but there was a book, the book that you shared with me when we started to speak about this has really, I had so many kind of thoughts about how this whole world works, how this location freedom life works. And the book that you shared with me, which was written back in 1997, that blows my absolute mind, that they predicted some stuff which is just now coming true. And countries that are offering these digital nomad visas, and you've got, I was thinking about you can see other countries trying to take, not take advantage of tourists and travelers, but doing things, like tourism taxes. Like Manchester's brought in a city tax. There are the Middle East have tourism taxes, to tax the people who don't live there but who reside there, to rather than income taxes and things like that. And that is exactly how that book described states are going to change. So I mean, I'll let you share that book, but that's another one that for anybody thinking about this life, that is just sharing where things are going.
So the book that Julie's referencing is a pretty famous book in this space now, but for those that people are in the kind of the space, which is The Sovereign Individual, Mastering the Transition to an Information Age. And as Julie says, it was written, late 90s or something like that. I mean, it's absolutely staggering. It came onto Audible only fairly recently, in the last 2 or 3 years. And the reason I kind of mentioned it to Julie, because I was listening to Julie and I was thinking, this is like a practical application of all of the commentary and almost forecasting, if you like, from The Sovereign Individual. She must have read it. She must sleep with it underneath her pillow. And
I do now.
and at the time, you hadn't even heard of the book, and it was like a bit of a revelation, wasn't it? So look, I'm not going to say much more about the book, and obviously, like with all, somebody once said to me, I have a book for every occasion. I really do. So this is the book for anybody who's interested in Digital Nomad, Sovereign Individual. I would always make the preface that, the views of the authors are their own. And by recommending the book, I'm not in any way like endorsing the ideology of the book. So, because there is stuff that some people with their orientation towards the world will find it jarring. So you've been warned, because it's pretty punchy in places, and depending on your worldview, you are likely to encounter bits in the book that you're going to find uncomfortable. You've been warned. Please don't send me a complaint. So we've not got long left, and I'm keen to let you go in due course. What I would just say about that book before we move off, though, is, and I wonder if this is your experience of reading it, isn't it striking that a book written over 20 years ago pretty much has foretold some of the big themes that we're seeing? So online digital currencies free of allegedly free of government control, stateless individuals who are migrating to countries who are offering them the best terms. And an example in Europe might be Portugal, for example, with the golden visas that they have, but they're all over the world now. You don't have to look too far to see these jurisdictions that are positioning themselves for the future and making it a really attractive place to be.
There was a sentence in that book which I actually stopped as I was walking and wrote it down, and it said, countries will start to see citizens as customers, not as assets. And I was just like, Estonia started it with their digital nomad visa, and another 54 have followed, attracting people like, come to us. And I think the Caribbean did it, didn't they, during COVID, where they offered a COVID visa. So and the time ago that they predicted it is amazing.
Yeah. And I would wish that I would wish and hope for, and I don't know, that the UK would adopt this as well, that, we would attract the greatest talented, innovative people on the face of the planet to come and join us in the UK and all the rest of it. We'll see how that progresses. So let's bring this to conclusion. So how can people get in touch with you? What's the best way of doing that?
I would say, contact me on socials. Drop me a DM on there.
Perfect. So I'll put the relevant links for all the things we discussed into the show notes. I suppose the final question is like, where are you going from here? I mean, quite literally, I suppose the question for you would be like, where literally are you going from here? But tell us your direction. Tell us your direction of travel. Like, what's next for you?
Okay, so for the last 15 months, we have sort of gone where the wind takes us. The brief was surf, ski, swim, sail around the world. So we didn't really make any plans from one month to the other. Over the next few months, though, we have got some plans for different reasons. So we're slow traveling down to Singapore next week. We're spending a couple of weeks in Singapore. Then we're going back to Thailand for 3 weeks. There's something we wanted to do there, so going back to Thailand for 3 weeks, and then we are heading to South Korea in the middle of June for just shy of 2 months, so until the start of August. So from August we'll go where the wind takes us.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. Well, look, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and wish you continued success with all of your journey, and thanks very much for taking the time out to speak to us.
Thank you for having me on, and hopefully get to see you to surf around the world or something with you at some point as well, Paul. I know that's something really.
I'm well up for that, Julie. We'll make sure that happens. So there
Cool.
you go, ladies and gentlemen.
Awesome.
That's Property Investor Podcast. Please feel free to like, subscribe, comment on the podcast. It really helps it get out there. Share it with a friend. And of course, you're always welcome to join me at the Property Investor Breakfast, whether in real life or in person. The link for it will be below. Final thanks again to Julie. Thanks very much for listening to the podcast, and we'll speak to you very soon.